Hey folks, Wild Philosophy here. Sorry for the absence over the last day, but I was detained by family issues. Now today I would like to talk about the novel The Nutcracker and the Mouseking, which was a children's novel written by the horror writer ETA Hoffmann in, I think, 1811 in the heart of the Napoleonic Wars. It is something most of you should be familiar with due to Tchaikovsky's famous ballet, The Nutcracker Suite. Although naturally the book deviates massively from the ballet. In fact, the ballet only covers about 20 pages, of the 100-page novel. Now, The Nutcracker and the Mouseking is interesting because it is the first novel I have reviewed on this channel that was explicitly religious. It's obviously a Christmas story, but more than that, Hoffmann tries to use it to illustrate the morals that we might learn from the event of Jesus' birth. And the so it's obvious. I myself am religious, full disclosure. So it was very, very interesting to me because you'll see Santa brought up a lot in popular culture around Christmas, or in the case of this novel, the Holy Christ, who's a somewhat different entity from Jesus Christ in the 19th century Protestant imagination. But it's intriguing because you normally Santa's a purely secular figure. You do not see him in his religious role as the announcer of the good news of Jesus' birth to men and woman, of course. But you, of course, run that is the novel. It is deeply. It's not so much explicitly stated. After the introduction, where we are told that the Holy Christ has given Mary, the main character, the Nutcracker, we don't run into we go about 80 pages without any explicit references to Christian theology, but the themes are fairly transparent for anyone who has studied the issue. Like Hoffmann, Hoffmann has the creator of the Sweet Kingdom be a man called the Confectioner, and at his name all fall silent in reverence and cease what ill deeds they're doing. And we see similarly Christian virtue. The point of the novel is to emphasize the joy that will come to us through self-sacrifice, which for anyone who has read the New Testament is the gist of much of the ethical content within that work. And so I'm going to have to spoil the plot here because my apologies. It's a very good book. But sorry, just a spare thought that I'll tack on to the end. But basically, Mary gets this Nutcracker, and then that very night, an army of rats comes to attack her. The Nutcracker jumps off the shelf along with her brother Fritz's toy soldiers, who launch a charge, but the toy soldiers run away and the Nutcracker is defeated. This leads to which also Mary saves his life, but she ends up getting injured. And while she's injured, we have a fascinating segue as to how the Nutcracker became a Nutcracker. And we are then, and that is basically used by the writer to condemn selfishness and greed, because it's a revenge plot. I don't have to go into detail on this one, but after she is recovered, the Mouseking comes, and he begins threatening to kill the Nutcracker unless Mary gives him something of hers. So each night he comes back, because she loves the Nutcracker. She chooses to sacrifice something that is near and dear to her. They're not. It's things like biscuits and toys. Not things that are that appear very important to us adults, but to children, these are, like, I know a lot of kids who would not sacrifice their biscuits for their friends. Different strokes for different folks, as it were. But eventually, she tells the Nutcracker what's been going on, and she then manages to help him find a sword because he's been disarmed, and gives him the courage to defeat the Mouseking. And then, of course, he takes her on the journey described in the Nutcracker suite. Vanishes. She thinks it's all a dream. Her family ridicules her, as does Mr. Drosselmeyer. But she keeps her faith in the Nutcracker strong. She knows that what she saw was true, and she doesn't actually suffer any doubt. And as a consequence, the Nutcracker returns, turned into a human, through her selfless love for him, and marries her. Ideally, it would remain a unconsecrated marriage because she would have been 8 or 9, according to the text at the time it occurred, which must have been an oversight on the writer's part. But yeah, so obviously the main theme present throughout the text, because we're told about it solely from Mary's view, is of faith, and how she has utter faith in the Nutcracker, who she loves with all her heart, and so she is willing to sacrifice anything. At one point, she nearly ends up giving up her clothing for the little doll, and she bears not only threats of violence, but ridicule from her family, and through this sacrifice becomes courage, and through it she is rewarded with she marries and becomes a princess, with her own kingdom, because the Nutcracker is an heir. Now, so the thing I paused for earlier, and the last element I'd like to emphasize about the book, is that the writing is atrocious. It is beyond awful. Admittedly, this might be the translation. I've obviously only read one edition of the book, which was actually, it was a pretty nice edition, one of the few good ones I've gotten off of Amazon's CreateSpace. I'll include a link to it in the video. But it's a very poorly written story, and yet that's not its charm, right? Because the story behind the ballet that more people are familiar also is not. It's not like it drags on a bit. Although in this case, it's just he's just a really bad writer, and a lot of his metaphors make no sense. And yet it's a deeply engrossing book. I read it in a day. I stayed up till like 4 a.m. finishing it. It was so good. Because it's not dealing with what we might call the real realm, or like the everyday world, even though it's set in a prosperous German middle-class home during the Napoleonic era. It deals with what C.S. Lewis has called the mythic realm, what Tolkien called the realm of fairy, and what Howard Pyle, who wrote Robin Hood, called the land of fancy. it deals with things that you have to describe rather than show. Things that it's a bit, to use an expression or an example familiar to those who have studied philosophy, it's a bit like the sun in Plato's allegory of the cave. No one can describe the sun. It is impossible. Even Plato, when Plato doesn't quite admit this in the book, he has hope that people can, but in practice, no one ever has. But you can describe everything about it. You can, like, most people have an excellent idea of what the sun is, what it does. Like, I think the quote by C.S. Lewis is, "Through I believe in God like I believe in the sun. You believe in the sun, not because I can see it, but because through it I can see everything else." I think that's the quote. And admittedly, maybe this isn't. Admittedly, like, the book isn't talking about God. Like the Nutcracker, I wouldn't go far enough as to call him an allegory for Jesus, because Mary does not join a nunnery at the end of the play, or end of the book, sorry. But it is certainly I think the mythic realm is very like that, where it lights up reality, even if you can never stare quite at it. So yeah, thank you for joining me. I will be speaking, I don't know what I'll be speaking on next. I need to review my finished novels list. A lot of philosophy books I don't want to cover. Like Uncle Ted's great book about cabins, if anyone can get the reference on that. But I will include, I'll be talking about Chesterton soon, because I've read 4 books of his this year. And so as a little preamble, I'll include a short essay by Chesterton on the meaning of Santa Claus for your edification at the bottom of this video.